on the issue of road safety and the inquiry that we've been promising ourselves now for some time, if not years. I'm going to start by asking members of the board to introduce themselves for the benefit of our attendees and also any members of the public currently watching via the webcast. And I'll come to our guests, witnesses, however we want to describe you, when we reach the substantive part of the agenda for which you're here. So I will start with Lisa.
Councillor Lisa Martin from Roundhay Ward.
Councillor Walsh, Heading Lane, Hyde Park, subbing for Councillor Shazad.
Good morning, Councillor Nicole Sharp for the Temple Newsham Ward.
And I'm Councillor Katie Dye from Killingbeck and Seacroft Ward.
Morning, Councillor Jacob Goddard from Roundhay Ward.
Morning, everybody. Councillor Arif Hussain Gipton, Hare Hills.
Neil.
Councillor Neil Buckley, Old Woodley Ward.
Councillor Jonathan Taylor, Horsforth and Roden Ward.
Councillor Paul Wadsworth representing Guys in Roden Ward.
Morning, it's Jonathan Bentley. I'm Councillor for Wheatwood.
Councillor Bob Gettings from Morley.
I'm Councillor Paul Trustwell. I represent Middleton and Bell. I'm also chair this scrutiny board. Okay, well, moving on to the agenda proper. Agenda item 1, appeals. There are none. Agenda item 2, exclusion of the public. No items for which that's applicable. Agenda item 3, late items. There were no late items. Agenda item 4, I'm assuming that any members who do have any pecuniary or other interests will have declared them. And apologies, we've got an apology from Councillor Shazad, and as Councillor Walshaw pointed out, he's subbing. Thanks. Good to see you, Neil. Right, moving on to agenda item 6, which basically are the terms of reference for this inquiry, which, as I say, is long overdue, but we have postponed it deliberately because we wanted to wait until we had the opportunity to have in-person meetings, especially for the members of the public and the campaigners who we're inviting along to both sessions. I mean, without a huge introduction from me, as I say, the figures for people killed and seriously injured on our roads has been a subject of great concern for the board. We do get the figures every year. Now, most years, certainly since I've been chairing the board, and that's about the last 5 years, I think, we have had specific sessions, but we decided last year that we really wanted to drill down in a bit more detail than we've been able to before. And the basic reason is that up to 2010, the KSI figures were reducing. Targets were based on that reduction. Since 2010, the figures at best have plateaued and at worst have increased. So there is now quite a gulf between the targets that we set ourselves and the actual reality. And final point for me is that this inquiry is split into 2 parts, which are very clearly indicated in both this document and also the more substantial document for agenda item 7. And I will try and be disciplined to do that. We have invited campaigners, and it's really good. Is it? I can't see from here. Is it Ian? Hi, Ian. Sorry, please forgive my my eyesight. Their role will be primarily to contribute to our next session, because we were very keen as part of this inquiry to invite community campaigners like Ian, who's also taken an academic approach, which is very welcome. And I think a number of people will be aware of the invaluable piece of work that he's done. So with that, I think the only other thing I will add is that in order to structure the discussion, rather than butterflying all around what is a rather comprehensive document, agenda item 7, I'm going to take us through it section by section so we can be more structured and focused, and we're not fragmenting the discussion by, as I say, butterflying around. Okay, that's a bit of a more long-winded introduction than I'd intended, but with that, I'm going to move to agenda item 7 and ask, I think it's Gillian McLeod and Lindsay McGarvey who are going to lead off from a Leeds City Council point of view in terms of introductory comments. I was also about to get to the executive board member, who's very welcome, Councillor Helen Hayden, who I think you've got free rein to chip in whenever you like. That's not me being sycophantic. It's just that I want you to be able to contribute at the appropriate point, Helen. And then I will move on to our police colleagues. And I think it's Superintendent Edward Chesters, who is going to lead off on that. And obviously then I'll open up to questions and comments from members, and anyone at the top table will feel free to chip in with your responses. So Helen, I will give you the opportunity at this stage, seeing as you're waving your hand at me.
Thank you. It's just, this is an incredibly important inquiry, but I'm going to have to leave at about 11 because I've got a low carbon food launch down at the market, which is very exciting as well. So I'm a bit double booked, but I wanted to be here to just lend my support and to this incredibly important agenda item. And I want to thank Scrutiny for the inquiry, because we do want to get, it's our passion and what drives officers and ourselves, and I know all of you, to get down to 0 so that those figures are zero. There is no appropriate number of people being injured either seriously or minor injuries, and certainly no number that is acceptable for people dying on our roads in Leeds. So I really welcome this inquiry and look forward to seeing the results of it. And I just want to thank the board and everybody here for their contributions, and apologies for having to leave, but I'm assuming I'll get fed as well when I get down there. So thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Helen. Before we pitch into the report, as promised, we're going to do a round of introductions, and I'll move on. Helen's introduced herself, Ian, and then the rest of the attendees.
Good morning, everybody. My name's Ian Greenwood. I'm a resident of Leeds. I live in Roundhay, and I've got 2 hats. The hat I've got on today is I'm a campaigner for road safety. I've got another hat, which is I'm a student at Leeds University, studying the politics of road death, understanding why people don't take road death seriously. So I'm really pleased to be here today and to hear that you're trying to take this seriously.
Good morning. My name's Vicky Franks. I'm the Safe and Sustainable Travel Team Leader for Road Safety.
Good morning, Lindsay McGarvey. I'm the Principal Transport Planner of the Influence and Travel Behaviour team, and we're leading on the Vision Zero strategy document.
Gillian McLeod, I'm Transport Development Services Manager for Leeds City Council, and I chair the Leeds Safer Roads Partnership.
Morning, everybody. Inspector Nick Berry from West Yorkshire Police. I'm an inspector based in Leeds District, and I sit on the Safer Roads Partnership Group representing the police.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Paul Jeffrey. I'm the Police Partnership Lead with specific responsibility for all traffic enforcement prosecutions across West Yorkshire, and also the Police Lead for enforcement using safety cameras, again, across West Yorkshire.
Morning, everybody. Ed Chesters from West Yorkshire Police. I've had the privilege of being recently promoted Chair to Chief Superintendent Head of Operational Support Division at Wakefield, but that brings with it the force-wide, county-wide remit for, amongst other things, roads policing. So delighted to be here. Also a member of the Safer Roads Exec for the Combined Authority.
Many thanks. Right, Gillian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, members. So I'm just going to do a very brief introduction in terms of the fact that the report covers the activity, casualty reduction activity that we've carried out in Leeds over the last couple of years. You'll see from the report that it hasn't been as extensive in the last couple of years, mainly due to the COVID-19 pandemic. We also cover the KSI figures for the last 5 years. And there are, well, we can get on to the detail of those, and Lindsay's available to go through that detail if you want to do it up front. but it is the issue that a new system of reporting actually has possibly set us back slightly. So the new crash system, whilst the introduction of that system has computerized the inputs, but what it's meant across the country and specifically across Leeds is that actually our KSI figures are going up, because a lot of accidents that were previously being recorded as slight injury accidents are now being recorded as serious injury accidents. So I just wanted to highlight that front and centre, because it's something we are going to have to have a really good look at. The DFT has provided figures so that we can, going forwards, we will be showing just the adjusted figures for the past few years. So they give us uplift percentages for us to actually adjust the figures from the past few years, but it will show actually that our KSIs are higher than we've previously reported them. The service and the Safer Roads Partnership is working on Vision Zero at the moment. We don't go through Vision Zero in this document because we are trying to finalise a draft strategy and action plan, which we're taking to the executive board in December. But safe to say, we are as a group discussing the new strands, the Safe Roads pillars, or the safe systems pillars, and that's something that we're working with the police and our partners in the Leeds Safer Roads Partnership. I think beyond that, I'm here to answer questions and Lindsay's here to answer questions, but would you like Lindsay just to take you through the actual statistics at this stage?
Yeah, I think that would be
the data. Okay, thank you.
So if you go to chapter 4 in the document, the first section sets out or gives a little bit of an explanation about the new way of reporting. Unfortunately, the DFT haven't released the full data set, so the figures may appear slightly confusing. We're reporting in some sections on 2016 to 2020. Those figures are unadjusted in section 4.21, and then there is a further table which offers 2016 to 2020 data. So I guess the discussion around this data, I'm not sure how relevant it would be at this stage, because it is almost between two different systems. The reporting, as well as in the traditional sense, where we look at the KSIs and then split it up into vehicles, ages, and driver types or groups and ages. And I think going forward as part of Vision Zero, it's very important to realise that although this has been the way to report in the past, we will need to change that focus and very much look at the causation of the killed and seriously injured crashes that have occurred, or collisions that have occurred. So I'm happy to go through in any detail that you would like, but I'm just not quite sure if it would be useful at this stage. But if you would like to, I certainly can.
Okay, thank you, Lindsay. I think when we reach our discussion on that part, then it will be open to comments and questions from members. So Superintendent Chesters.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I think crash is obviously a fairly recent change of methodology in terms of reporting, and I suppose with the advent of any such system, there are always teething problems, and I can give a quick example of that in terms of notification of fatalities to relevant members. So teething problems, I do personally think it is an advancement in how we are analysing casualties, KSI, across, well, certainly Leeds, but again, from my perspective as force representative right across the West Yorkshire County. So there are advantages to it. There are teething problems, as I say, but overall, I think it gives us a much better information and intelligence product, which, and I'm sure we'll come to it in due course, has been my principal observation since inheriting the road safety portfolio. I think there's a strong focus on demographics within the reporting, but I'm sure people and colleagues will appreciate that in order to focus the smart, intelligent activity around prevention and enforcement, we need to know where, we need to know when, how and who are involved in sort of micro detail, really. So I think in terms of an information and intelligence product, if you forgive the police terminology for 1 minute, because that's the methodology we operate along, those specifics will start to develop from crash, and we'll be able to focus our operational activity a lot more intelligently around that. So I don't know, are there any specific questions about crash as it stands? As I say, it's definitely in embryonic stages, but I think a number of other forces have already implemented and start to see the benefits from it.
Right, I think there may be in due course as I go through the report.
Sure.
Okay, is there anyone else at the top of the table who wants to chip in at this stage, or can I throw it out to members of the board for questions and observations?
Chair, just one additional point in relation to crash, if I may. The national adjustment on the historic data that we usually rely on is applied to every force area up and down the country. And in practical terms, what that adjustment allows for is the difference in the categorisation of injury that crash has brought about, in contrast to the officer-generated categorisation that we used under Stats 19. And in a really simplistic way, if you think of this as an example, it'll illustrate what I'm talking about. If you had a broken finger under the old Stats 19 data collection system, an officer would have recorded that as a minor injury. Crash automatically categorises that as a serious injury. So it's that level of detail that we're talking about. It's not a massaging of figures downwards, it's a new definition that's applied by crash.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Right, as I said at the outset, I'm going to go through the report section by section in order, as I say, to structure the discussion, although I suspect there may be far more questions and comments on some sections of it than there are on others. So starting on page 18, and this is of our printed agenda as opposed to the report itself. The introductory section, are there any questions on that section? No? Okay. Yes, Jonathan, by all means.
It was really just before we begin. I noticed the letter from Gillian, which I think the exec member said in a response to a question at full council that she would lobby the Department for Transport on camera criteria. So I do thank her for that. But whilst appreciating that she does have demands on her time, we have been waiting for this for a long time, and I would think it is appropriate for it to be noted that there should be a deputy exec member or someone from the administration throughout this meeting to hear what we've got to say. But that's not to do with page 1, but that's just my feelings before we start. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that. It is obviously an issue that's concerned us and that has arisen in our discussions in previous years. I'm sure that the message has got over. Unfortunately, logistically, we can't always ensure that people can be in two places at once. In fact, we never can ensure that. So moving on to section 2. Yeah, Ian, what I would say from the chair is that normally questions are for members of the board. Let's look at members of the board, but I think with the leave of members of the board, because we've been so keen for the participation of community campaigners like Ian, I think we can exercise a little bit of latitude here. So if it is just to raise a point rather than using up the time you're going to get at the next meeting for making a much more extensive contribution and possibly presentation, I think if it's just a point that you want to raise under this particular section, then feel free to do so, Ian.
Thank you for making an exception. I appreciate that. And I just want to raise a point about language, Chair, and which I think is really very important. And reading the document and listening to the introductions this morning, it seems that we're in this transition from kind of old speak, or what I would call old-fashioned road safety, to kind of new speak, which is Vision Zero and reducing road danger. And I just illustrate that with the words used, reduction is your title of the appendix. So that completely contradicts just the way this is set out today is casualty reduction activity in Leeds. Language is really important to victims. Language is really important in terms of how politicians take action. Using the word accidents, I know DFT don't change their definitions, but the use of accidents is also problematic. And the third thing I'll say, and then I'll shut up, is the word victim is rarely used. I've not heard it today yet. I think you introduced it, Chair, in terms of introducing today's session. But in the documentation, I couldn't find the word victim. And I will thank you for the invitation to talk next time. But I will emphasize why I'm doing what I'm doing. And it is about victims and the result that then follows from that devastation that happens to victims. So language, I just want to make the point about language today. And as I say, I'll shut up.
Okay, thanks very much, Ian. So has anyone got any other questions to raise on section 2? From the chair, I just wanted, and it may be that we can concentrate on this in other sections that go into more detail, because obviously the first 2 chapters, for want of a better expression of this document, are fairly general. But on paragraph 2.3.2, which is on page 22 of our agenda, 2.3.2 of the report, could I just ask our police colleagues about the use of pro lasers? And I suppose to some extent I'm raising this because of my parochial experience as a ward member, where this has been quite a movable feast. At one stage, our MPT had people trained but no pro laser. Then they got a pro laser, and because of the dynamics of where people move, we lost all the people who were trained. As ward members, we then found some money to provide training through, I think, the trainers from Wakefield, from Cargate, doing overtime. We now seem to have lost most of those trained people, and it makes it very difficult when you've got that fluctuating picture. Now, I suspect some of this is down to the fact that as West Yorkshire Police have been recruiting, hopefully to fill some, if not all, of the vacancy of the officers lost between 2010 and 2015. There are more demands on training, and pro laser training has to take its place in that. Having said that, as the report very rightly emphasises, it is the major source of concern within the community, when in the past the Police and Crime Commissioner has consulted local people on their concerns and priorities. So I'm just wondering how far we get into grips, because again, in my area, and I'm sure it's not unusual, we've now got the situation of a pro laser, but we're waiting for an officer to be trained in its use. And again, we're offering to find money for overtime to try and make sure that more officers are trained in its use. So, sorry, it's quite a convoluted question, but I'm sure that it's clear what I'm getting at.
No, that's fine, and it makes absolute sense, Chair. Thank you. And I think you're absolutely right to identify the training challenges that the force has got. I think everybody will be aware of the proposed uplift around 20,000 officers nationally, which gives us about 890, which is significant. So without going into the finite detail around that, we know that there are multiple challenges around prioritising training delivery from all aspects of policing, from safeguarding through to cyber, which is an emerging threat and something very present in our minds at the moment. But of course, that's not to dismiss the importance of roads policing enforcement as well. So I think from a force perspective, there is the continued challenge around allocation of resources, and the some very hard debates at times about what we effectively spend our money on. And I suppose I'll invite Nick in from a Leeds perspective in terms of what neighbourhood teams currently do around pro laser, what their challenges are. Because certainly whilst we look to protect our neighbourhood teams and ensure that they have the capacity and capability to deliver on local priorities, oftentimes we find at the moment that they are drawn in to call handling and attending the 999 calls because of the resource challenges we face. But that's clearly not to make excuses. It's about how we work more intelligently on a daily, weekly and monthly basis. So Nick, can I bring you in?
Yeah, Chair, obviously you'll be aware that there are trained staff in the neighbour policing teams that use the Pro Laser. We would always like to have more members of the teams trained. They have to go to, at the moment, force training school to have that done through driver training, as I understand it. They do have the Pro Laser and they use it, and we've had some really good results from it. And I think a lot of it is put on social media when we do have the Pro Laser device out. It seems to get a mixed response from members of the public every time we do it. But we've got broad shoulders, and we're quite happy that we are effectively the challenges you said we did, because when members of the public report that there are incidents of, for example, speeding, then they will deploy with the Pro Laser. And obviously you'll be aware that Inspector Leadbeater, which in the south, will deploy her team on the hotspot areas with the Pro Laser, and either publish results to say that there was an issue or there wasn't an issue, because that's often the case sometimes as well. Although we do reports of speeding, sometimes members of the public, when we go and do the enforcement, are keeping to the limits. The data is collated under Operation Amberland, which is the neighbourhood policing response to road safety issues, as highlighted through either web chat or packed meetings or emails to neighbourhood policing teams around local problems. And they will deploy as and where required, really. I think that we could have more staff trained, but it's, as Mr. Chester says, it's a balance between training them on other issues, like, for example, safeguarding, cybercrime, and all the other demands that come with it. And over the last, obviously, 18 months, the focus has been on, obviously, trying to resume some sort of normality around the issues that COVID has developed. So a lot of the neighbourhood policing teams were involved in high profile hotspot areas around education people around the enforcement of the COVID legislation, which obviously was a very difficult job as well.
Okay, thank you. I've got Jonathan, Bob, and then Paul.
Thanks, Chair. It's a sort of the same sort of question as yours. It's about the approach, I think, to road safety, and in our wards, I suppose the top issue is speeding, particularly now we have so many 20-mile-an-hour areas, which our residents say, well, they're not enforced. And I know there's a criteria and there's a formula, etc. But as far as residents concerned, people are doing 30 miles an hour and 20 miles an hour. Why is that? And it's this almost sort of the silo approach, I think, that we get of, well, that's a police responsibility. And of course, the police haven't got the resources. They haven't got the resources and sometimes the will, because of the other side of the same coin, I suppose. And it doesn't help. And this is not meant to be a political point, Chair, but it's a fact that in my ward, I can only speak in my ward, but I know that there's been a lot less emphasis on road safety and speed enforcement because we've had a huge reduction in our PCSOs. And that's not a West Yorkshire Police issue, it's a council issue, but it is a fact, and it has been making an impact. So when it comes to, well, yes, we can deploy the Pro Laser, or we can put some officers on looking at parking issues. The officers, PCSOs, who would sometimes do that, are just not there. But it's about whose responsibility it is, I think, and it's not just a police responsibility, and it's how we as a council, and this is sort of I think it's part of the tenure of the whole report, really, how we as a council take I don't like using the word holistic, but holistic approach to it. So everybody sees themselves as part of the solution. And if I can just sort of give a quick example, this probably isn't even a question, Chair.
We're all trying hard to pick the question out.
Yeah. Well, I suppose it's our approach to it, really. The question, I suppose, is how we get that involvement of everybody, everyone seeing it as their responsibility. And I'll just give a very quick example. Again, parochially in my ward, this is the only experience we've got. A school, and I won't say which one, starts using a different exit and entrance gate. That is then causing a problem in the particular street where that's happening. So when residents complained about that, the school says, oh, well, no, it's a police issue. If there's poor parking or speeding, call the police, they will deal with it. Well, we all know you call the police, it won't get dealt with, or won't get dealt with at that point. The school says nothing to do with us. So it's that sort of silo mentality that says, whereas the school should be saying, what is the impact of what we're doing? And the same with the residents, the same with businesses. You can't just get into that silo mentality. So it's about how we spread that responsibility so people understand that. And also, when there is an issue, who do you actually go to get that approach? Because if you just go to the local neighbourhood police team, they will say, well, we'll deal with that issue, which is the parking or the speeding, but we can't at the moment because we haven't got anybody available, and it never gets dealt with. So we're not getting down to the source of it, the cause of it. It's all about dealing with the symptoms of it. And because of resources and all the other things, we're not even able to deal with that. It's a bit like the NHS, you know, you're trying to deal with the symptoms, and that's taking up so much of your resources, you can't deal with the causes of it. So there is a bit of a question there, Chair, I think, but for a comment.
Yeah,
back,
I mean, well, if I chip in with a question on top of that, which I think may cover much of what you've said, I think we get the message and have done over the years that there are strategic partnerships, there are district-wide partnerships. But I suppose the point that Councillor Bentley is making is that we don't see the kind of practical, on the ground, local partnerships to address some of these issues, so that we're bringing together not just police colleagues to talk about community safety, but highways and other relevant agencies to tackle them.
Put it so much better than I could have, Chair. That's exactly what I was saying.
Chair, thanks. I think from a police perspective, neighbourhood policing has done and always will continue to evolve in its approach. Of course, it's dependent on resourcing, without using that as the sort of golden thread throughout this morning's discussion. However, I suppose the ethos of policing is prevention rather than reacting, and the partnership approach is the key pillar behind that. And of course is why neighbourhood policing teams exist, to work in partnership with other agencies to problem solve, prevent and intervene early where at all possible. That sadly, I suppose, doesn't always bring with it a guarantee that, to use the example there, that a school making an understandable decision to change the traffic flow on its own premise would necessarily see a need to engage with the neighbourhood policing team. So, and from that point on, we're reacting, I guess, aren't we, in turn, rather than being upstream and preventing it ever being an issue. So it is understanding and creating partnership hubs within localities where those conversations would normally take place as a matter of course, rather than people having to think, who do we now need to engage because we're changing the in and the out gate to whichever the school was mentioned there. So I know that's just, I don't want to call it a small example because clearly it's an important one for local residents in that particular case, but the wider ethos around that level of engagement, it does need to be that. It's just facilitating it at the moment. And again, I suppose with the governmental renewed emphasis behind neighbourhood policing, one would expect to see again named officers per wards. And actually we do have that, but it's again, without reiterating it too much, it's about the wider awareness of that within wards, so that whatever the issue under consideration is, becomes natural habit to consult, engage and look at preventative measures, rather than it's down to the police now to enforce that, which we would have a view on, I'm sure.
Before I bring you back in, Jonathan, if you want to come back, could I just ask what imperatives from the centre kind of are disseminated locally in terms of priorities for tackling concerns about speeding and antisocial driving? And I do appreciate that if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority, and there's got to be some sort of focus. But I have to say, in my area, and I hope it's not atypical, we have very good working partnership around antisocial behaviour, where we get in a multitude of people: housing, youth services, police, even first bus, because of some of the incidents. It would be nice to replicate that in terms of road safety, but we don't seem to do it. So as I say, I'm just wondering, how are things driven from the centre in terms of the prioritisation of road safety?
Okay, so if I may then, if I start from a national perspective, because I think this will help hopefully understanding of the intent which exists now, but will obviously take a little while to play through. I think nationally for policing, there's a recognition that roads policing, and then that there is clearly a wider spectrum around road safety, generally speaking. But from roads policing point of view, there's an acceptance that that has lost importance over several years. I think, having been involved in this world for several months now, I can quite confidently state that UK policing sees all matters pertaining to roads on an equal footing with terrorism, with cyber attacks, with significant safeguarding issues. So, like I say, I'm confident in saying that the status afforded to roads policing activity is clearly on the up, and the focus on that nationally, regionally, and then locally for West Yorkshire, but clearly for Leeds as well, is very much coming to the fore. We have I hate to call it a document really, so a strategy, the strategic policing requirement, which encompasses those high-level threats, as we call them, is being lobbied strongly for to include roads policing, as I say, on a similar footing to the other threats I've outlined. So nationally, the impetus is there. Clearly, that will take some time to play through. But as I say, I'm confident that that will start to become one of our priorities for West Yorkshire and, of course, Leeds in the months and years to come. Resourcing that then becomes the other main debate, of course. So from a national point of view, I think that's where we're at currently. That will then feed into the development of our strategic plans. The precinct crime plan, which I know is under refresh at the moment for obvious reasons, I think I can quite plainly say that that's very much in focus as well for Deputy Mayor for Policing.
Okay, thanks for that. And I'm obviously in this particular section of the report at 2.41, we've got the road policing recommendations emanating from the road policing not optional report, and it looks as though West Yorkshire are beginning, are ticking a lot of the boxes around that.
Yeah, we do have a comprehensive action plan around that. So so I've explained that the plan up to recent weeks is around the pillars of prevention, pursue, protection, partnership work. We are discussing how we now translate that into a Vision Zero methodology, because the crossovers are quite clear and evident. There are aspects of our plan that we do need to retain in a separate document, because it will relate to things like staff training, so very police specific activity. But I suppose if it's a reassurance to the panel today, having the force-wide perspective, I can quite confidently say again that Leeds' commitment to the Vision Zero progress is clear and distinct from other authorities across the county, if that helps.
Okay, thank you. I have a few questions that kind of follow on from that in the next section, but Jonathan, I'm sorry, I'll let Tim. Do you want to come back on anything?
No, it's fine. I think in terms of where we're going forward, this is going to be a big aspect of what we're looking at. There's no answers to this. This is part of what we're trying to get the answers to, isn't it?
Sure. Okay, Bob.
Thanks, Chair. I agree with what you say, Chair, and you, Jonathan, said, and your experiences are exactly mine. In my ward, in my village, we have a very close relationship with a neighbourhood police team and with our schools as well. Our schools do posters, stick on dustbins about speeding and so forth. But it's the enforcement issue that is the biggest issue in my village, in that we work well with the police. I arranged for them to come and use their gun at specific times, specific places, they come once and then follows a whole stream of not excuses, reasons why they're on leave or they haven't got a trained person to use the gun available at that time. And it just becomes really a bit of a nonsense. And I welcome the fact that the West Yorkshire Police Safer Roads strategy is going to work in partnership. It's going to listen to people. It's going to understand the communities. But how are you going to do that? Because there obviously is an issue of the number of police officers available and enough trained officers to do the job. So I just don't know how we're going to move forward if we haven't got the people to do it.
Sorry, at the risk of chipping in, when we discussed this previously, I think it was probably 2 years ago, we were told, I think, that the resources, the actual staffing resources going into road policing may be across the piece as opposed to NPT level, were actually being increased to reflect the priority that the force was giving to enforcement around road safety issues. Is that still the case?
So of course, each district commander has autonomy for the resources they allocate to every sphere of policing activity under their control. I think it would be wrong for central control to be imposed on district commanders in that respect, because of course every district and indeed every ward has its own bespoke issues, don't they? So I suppose I completely understand the sentiments around and the frustrations about perceived lack of activity. And without sounding too apologetic for this, clearly there are some very tough discussions we have at a district and a force level about what we allocate to what threat on a daily basis, according to the level of risk that poses to the wider public. So clearly local issues do present significant concerns to residents. There is obviously a force-wide picture that we need to consider on a daily basis. So where we might initially have headlined resources for a particular role or a particular deployment at any given day, that genuinely can change within a matter of minutes or hours, depending on the calls coming in, the threats being presented. And clearly we have to make some very difficult decisions about what then takes precedence in terms of priority threat. And we might have to divert, cancel, redesign and redeploy according to that need. I think probably something that we can work more effectively on is the communication around the why we might not have turned up at a certain place at a certain time, or indeed why we've had to deploy elsewhere. But again, I'm sure most people will appreciate that we can't always publicise the reasons for that, for the risk of operational compromise. So clearly understand the frustrations, but clearly we have some very difficult decisions to make on a daily basis about how we best use our resources. But to wrap that particular answer up, this brings me back to my original observation about the information and intelligence products that we have available to us and how we more intelligently deploy according to the evidence that tells us actually you would be better off there than there, for example, with the resources we have available.
Sure, and of course we're coming on to that. I mean, I think we all understand the conflicts, too few officers chasing too few priorities. But I suppose my question was more about those officers who are deployed whose role is specifically traffic and nothing else. I think we were reassured that there was going to be an increase in that particular complement of
so
officers.
Yeah, and if it's a reassurance again, reverting back to a national perspective, West Yorkshire compared to other forces across the UK did see the sense in retaining roads policing resource. I think there are other forces across the country who, because of resource and demand conflict, decided to dispense with roads policing specialists and are obviously suffering significant issues as a result of that. So I think West Yorkshire on a force basis were pressing enough to retain resources in that sphere. I personally don't think they're enough, if I can be blunt, I suppose as force lead for roads policing. I don't think there are, and so I could talk through the deployment pattern for today, which clearly we have some compared to other forces across the country, but in terms of what we're trying to achieve, it isn't sufficient, I don't think. But those funding and deployment and resource allocation discussions are still to be had, and of course we have comprehensive spending review at the back end of this year, which will again further influence the decision making around what we actually spend our allocated budget on.
Thank you. Bob, do you want to come back? Oh, sorry, Gillian. Sorry, no, it's...
Thanks, here it's Lindsay.
It's Lindsay. Yeah.
Sorry, I think it's just important to remember too that the Vision Zero approach might see a change to the way that we enforce, and the responsibility might not just be on the police. So there's technological advancements that could be used around detection, and that could be in vehicle detection, and that might seem quite far away at the moment. But that collective action and movement towards Vision Zero could see changes in legislation around how vehicles or drivers can be enforced. So, and I know that Paul's working with the Camera Partnership at the moment around changes to help with that enforcement as well. So I think we all just need to remember that the current way of enforcement might not be the future way as well, and it might be there's more cost-effective ways, and the onus isn't going to be just on the police. So it's about looking forward and better use of resources as well. So yeah, we just need to keep an open mind about what's coming down the line.
Sure, thank you for that, Lindsay. And I think to reassure our police colleagues, although we're kind of focusing in on enforcement, I think we do recognise, like ASB, partnership working across the piece with everybody doing their bit as part of that matrix is the way forward. It's just that obviously the perception is that people see tearaways flying around the street, and like any problem of that nature, they want it hitting with a stick. And we as ward councillors want it hitting with a stick. And I suppose it's that kind of sharp end of the issue that makes us home in on enforcement. But Lindsay's quite right, you know, at the end of the day, we're not going to address these problems or achieve the objectives without a lot more cooperation and the jigsaw puzzle fitting in together. So you wanted to come back?
Yeah, I suppose just on that point, and thank you obviously for the supportive comments there, but we're really clear. So for example, on the antisocial behaviour front, that the 12-year-old on a quad bike tomorrow afternoon motoring around an estate is clearly the potential KSI statistic of future weeks and months. So we do come back to the partnership effort to intervene early and prevent, hopefully, rather than react, will be the onus for us. Yeah.
Thank you. Bob, did you want to come back on any of that?
Yes, just to say, it is a matter of perceptions. And when you get in a ward, a parish council, 13 councillors, working closely with the police, understanding that at any time police can be taken off to do with something more urgent, they understand that, but they also don't understand why the police don't come back and then deal with the issue at hand. The issue doesn't go away. There's understanding, but there's also frustration as well. And to be just left thinking, I've yet again to contact the police and try and rearrange this, I don't think that's the councillor's job, if I'm honest. And in the end, you give up because you're so busy. You give up on it, but the public perception remains. So I think, yes, there's understanding, and there's a close relationship between the parish council in my ward and the police. On a monthly basis, we meet. So it's just frustrating that, and the public perception of things, that nothing has been done, whilst there are idiots driving at great speed through the village. And in our village, because we're between the Halifax Road and the Huddersfield Road, we did a traffic count the other morning, and there's 400 cars between 8 o'clock and 9 o'clock go through the village as a shortcut. And I think most of the village people will respond and acknowledge that it's a 20-mile limit through the centre of the village. I don't think it's the village people who are ignoring that traffic. It's the people coming through, the 400 people coming through the village between 8 and 9 o'clock in the morning, who are living busy lives. They want to get from A to B, and they don't even though there's traffic bumps, sleeping policemen, screens showing your speed, they just ignore it because they know it's not going to be enforced. That's the truth of it. Sorry, Chair.
Okay, thanks. No, we'll take that. We'll take that as a comment. But it looks as though we're kind of going in a direction. Obviously, it's early days in terms of the work that we're doing at the moment, of trying to establish how we might have more localized partnerships, and not necessarily looking to our police colleagues to resource and service those And maybe it's something that could be done under community committees and communities if that's not too wide an area. But road safety is not something that just is restricted to ward boundaries. There are knock-on effects. So maybe that's a thought we can bear in mind. Paul Wadsworth.
Thank you, Chair. You lead us through this, don't you, Chair, quite easily with regards to that. I was actually wanting to come back about the pro laser comments that you made, which is that obviously the pro laser, I am assuming, is the standing at the street and raising the vehicles and then issuing a ticket, which has to be done by a uniformed officer with training. I have a lady in my ward who is very, very active with the SID machine. She doesn't share her data, which is not that helpful, but she does collect a lot of data, I'm led to believe, by Facebook. Councillors have also provided SID machines for lampposts, as have the local parish council. And the question really is which influences the driver behaviour the best? Because one is a reminder in the case of the ones on the lampposts, one is there may be some enforcement behind it, and the third one, which is operated by you as a police, is there is some enforcement because you stopped giving a ticket and it hits you in the pocket and on your driving licence. But overall, bearing in mind the limitations that you have and the reliance on volunteers and the funding that councils have, which influences driver behaviour mostly across the piece? And secondly, with regards to traffic policing and roads policing, have I used the same two words for the same officers, or do we have, because I know that roads policing is more evident out on our motorways where I understand you are dealing with more major crime, and that does spill out into places like Morley where you do see more traffic cars. But in my own ward, where I'm a long way from a motorway, I rarely see a traffic car, and I rarely see a traffic car that is doing what I would call traffic work, which is sitting in a street end trying to catch some of these idiots that are either on quad bikes or on what look to be high performance vehicles that are going at excessive speed. Is traffic and roads policing the same thing?
There is a distinction. So at Cargate at Wakefield, which is the force base for the eastern side of the county, and then also Trafalgar House at Bradford for the western side of the county, you do have, they're the roads policing unit. So I know there's a bit about semantics here, but there is a distinction. So the roads policing unit for West Yorkshire Police are your specialist responders with the higher level training, experience and skills to deal with some of the KSI matters that we've already referenced this morning. Trained investigators who will command that scene and see that through to its resolution. The distinction between that and local policing will be local officers who may have, in varying degrees, experience and skills within the roads policing arena, but they are district officers who will respond to the lower level issues around traffic enforcement. So there is that force district difference, if that makes sense. But Paul, I think you're going to come in on driver attitude, I think.
Yeah, I think the point you raise is a really important one. Before I give you the definitive answer, if I might just sort of point out that we're all concerned about speed because speed takes lives. That's what kills people when it's used inappropriately in an unsafe setting. But there are a range of operational tactics that we as a partnership can throw at that as an issue. It's not just about taking somebody to court. And I think primarily the starting point is invariably, let's get some evidence around the scale of the problem. Let's understand the time of day, the type of driver, the type of vehicle, the dynamics of the problem. And that's something that we really can improve upon collectively as a partnership, because proper evidence-led problem solving, which is a central tenet to the Vision Zero approach, the safe systems approach to preventing casualties, should be evidence-based. So the first point I'd make is, let's get a proper rather than anecdotal understanding of the exact nature of the problem we're trying to address. Once we've done that, we can start to develop a range of tactics to throw in the direction of that problem. Now, that may well start off with education and publicity. So getting out there, engaging with the public, helping them to understand why driving at 25 in a 30-mile-an-hour limit when the school is open might be actually inappropriate, although it's legal. So that might be the first line of approach to a problem. But what we should have is a range of solutions, from education and publicity, through engineering, through engagement by uniformed police officers and staff at the roadside. And ultimately, if we still get poor compliance around a speeding issue, we go in with enforcement. Now, the enforcement takes many different shapes and forms. It could be a joint initiative involving the community themselves, working alongside a PCSO and neighbourhood policing officer. It could be a roads policing officer. It could be a combination of all three at different times of day. It could, in certain circumstances, involve the deployment of mobile speed enforcement safety cameras, or indeed the installation of a static camera. Vision Zero actually is a platform around which we can better collaborate and deliver a joined up solution, so that if some of these expensive resources, be them in the local authority or indeed the police, are brought to bear at that location, or we invest some valuable time in working with the community, it's done to maximum effect. Now, having been party to the deliberations around Vision Zero in the Leeds Safer Road Partnership, I honestly believe there's a real commitment there to improve this frontline operational collaboration, so that the existing resources that we've got, never mind any growth that may happen in the future, the existing resources will be better focused and better coordinated. So to come back to the question that you posed, speed indicating devices, handheld pro laser, yes, they have an effect, but you could ask two drivers, one will say, doesn't matter a jot to me because my car isn't registered in my own name and you're not going to catch me by sending a notice of intended prosecution. But conversely, you'll get another driver who absolutely will have the message around proper speed compliance reinforced by the presence of somebody stood with a camera. So there is no simple answer. It depends on the mindset of the driver, their understanding of the danger that they create, because that will shape their attitude. And of course, that can only be achieved through ongoing engagement and reinforcement of the importance of compliance. But they are all valuable and legitimate tactics once we understand the nature of the problem.
Of course.
Just come back on the data collection, because
Yes.
the lady that is very active in my ward collecting the data doesn't share it with me. I'm led to believe she shares it with the council. So probably she shares it with Gillian, I'm not sure. But the SID machines that councillors and parish councillors fund do collect that data on the machine, but getting that data actually out of the machine by the council is an impossible task now, because I believe that they stopped taking it out of those machines some time ago and we're going to train us up. And now that they're not able now, don't have the capacity to adapt our laptops to actually collect that data. So if you weren't enabled beforehand, some parish councils are and are collecting it, then you're not able to be enabled now, I believe. So we're at that position. But ultimately that data is collected, and where it is collected, and in my own parish council, which is Rawdon, where it's collected, we get a very good picture of Rawdon itself and where those SIDs are and what data they're collecting. We aren't professional enough to be able to analyse the next step, which is what we do to slow people down. We can tell that they're going fast and what time they're going fast and whether they slow down as they're approaching the SID or whether they speed up when they're going away from it. But we can't actually get the next step, which is what the public want, which is to slow those vehicles down, because we require either highways or the police to give us advice on how we spend the next lot of money on doing the job right. And that's the point. And I'm posing that not just to yourself, but to Gillian as well.
And my apologies again in chipping in from the chair, but we've had this discussion so often from a parochial point of view as well as a board point of view. In the past, and I don't know whether these have been used in Leeds, I know they were certainly used in Bradford, there have been initiatives where volunteers have been able to use SIDs, and in some cases even pro lasers, in order to clock people's speeds, and for the vehicle owners then to receive a warning letter. Clearly that's not a ticket, but it is another, it helps to pull people up. I'm just wondering whether what the view is of that approach, because I know alongside that there is fear about the security and safety of the volunteers, because as we know, some drivers take exception to being told that they're driving too fast. So I just wonder whether that is still the overwhelming view, or whether there is any room for the sort of volunteer partnership that is then backed up with a warning letter or other sanction, for want of a better expression. Yeah. Oh, right. Okay.
Thanks, Chair. The schemes to which you refer are commonly known as community speed watch type initiatives. They take place up and down the country in various guises. In some cases, members of the public who've had some training will stand at the roadside with either a SID or a handheld speed detection device, and that will either just be a visible deterrent or may lead to the issue of warning letters. Other schemes operated involve a joint approach between the police, either a constable or a PCSO, working hand in glove at the roadside with the community, and that can legitimately result in two possibilities. An actual stop of an offending vehicle by a police vehicle that's further down the road, which is very effective because you have face-to-face contact, you identify the driver, and you can go down the warning or prosecution route from that point. Or alternatively, it results in the generation of a letter to the registered keeper of the offending vehicle. Where you have sole community activity of that type tends to be in the more rural, leafy force areas up and down the country. I have the privilege of leading the police speed enforcement unit, and I know from bitter experience that in our urban environments, regrettably, my support staff, mobile operators, encounter significant violence and physical attack on the vehicles. With the benefit of that experience, I'm very, very cautious about allowing the public to take what is a type-approved piece of equipment and use that in a pseudo-enforcement role, even if it's just warning letters. I'm not eliminating that as a possibility. Personally, I would favour a joint approach if we were to embark on that level of activity, which was properly risk assessed given the inherent risks in certain locations. The shelf life of a warning only type approach is very limited, because with the advent of social media, it quickly becomes known that all you're going to get is a letter through your letterbox, which is a metaphorical tap on the wrist. We have to have in our mind's eye a means of escalation to the next level, i.e. prosecution, if we're to embark on that sort of strategy. So that would be my word of caution. Health and safety concerns for the public needs to be properly thought through, and we need to acknowledge the limited shelf life of a warning only type approach and have an exit strategy. Either we acknowledge that we've had a short-term benefit and then see what happens, or if compliance continues to be poor, we then need to embark on the next stage to up the ante. And that needs to be part of a well thought through deployment strategy for speed enforcement.
And I think that final sentence started to answer Councillor Wadsworth's question. Where do we move on from where we are at the moment? And it was about data collection, which I think is probably a question for our highways officers.
I was going to say just that. It's great that the community is generating this data. Ed highlighted the importance of information feeding the machine that then directs resources. And that's something we're really passionate about in the police. We're not the only source of data regarding collision, speed compliance. We have colleagues across, well, many different stakeholders that have stuff to offer, including the community. So that data from your SIDS for me is really, really valuable in helping people such as Nick here deploy their valuable resources to best effect. And indeed, in certain circumstances, there will be opportunities for me to deploy static and mobile speed cameras. So the issue, and I'll pick this up with colleagues in highways, is how we use that information that's generated from the SIDS in our problem-solving approach, alongside the formal traffic flow survey data that comes from those strips that you see across the road, because it's just another form of data that can help us give a better understanding on the degree of non-compliance that a particular stretch of road has, and particularly the times of day when compliance is at its worst. And that again helps us focus our resources in the right area at the right time.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So I think, unfortunately, I'm not aware of this specific SID data, Councillor Wadsworth, but it may be that our traffic management colleagues are receiving that data from the lady in question. So I will take that back and just double check. We do, the traffic engineering side of things, we do tend, and as Paul has just said, we do different types of counts if we think there is a speeding issue. And that's a process that we've got that the traffic engineering team will have these tubes laid across the road that can pick up, it's automatic traffic count, it can pick up the speed of that traffic. So if we are to do any engineering interventions, we would do it off the back of automatic traffic counts rather than the SID data specifically. But clearly, I mean, the SID's very useful visual, demonstrating the issue, demonstrating the community has a concern about speed in an area. So I think they have they're a very useful tool, certainly have a place in the work that we do. But in terms of engineering, it's not something we would rely on.
Okay. Okay. Yes, of course, Paul.
Requires a yes or no answer, Gillian. Do you collect data from the SID machines in Guys-on Roden or any other ward in the city? And are you able to do that? And are you prepared to do that?
I'm not aware that we collect data from any of the SID machines in the city. Am I able to do it? It very much depends on whose SID it is. I don't know that there's a data collection feedback on the SID, so it's something I'll have to go away and speak to our traffic engineering colleagues on. If we had the data, we would certainly make use of it. As Paul Jeffries has mentioned, we'd be able to look at times of day, excess speed in location. So we could certainly make use of it, but at the moment it's not something that I'm aware we have access to.
Okay, thank you. I mean, just more a comment from me than a question. I do appreciate the point that you make, Paul, about using hard, fast, robust data as a basis for initiatives, partnership initiatives. But on the other hand, the fear of crime always seems to exceed the data. And yet fear of crime, whether it's antisocial behaviour, whether it's speeding or whatever, is very debilitating for individuals and communities and has a lot of spin-off effects. So to some extent, having a shop front where people are seen to be doing things and the community's concerns, which may be inflated, are being addressed, can't be diminished. And I'm sure you're aware of that it's a bit like justice being seen to be done in terms of assuaging some of the community's concerns. Right, I've got Councillor Walshaw, Councillor Dye, and then back to Councillor Bentley.
Thanks, Chair. It's always interesting to come into a scrutiny board as a substitute and to be have to look at such a detailed and interesting piece of work, and to be acutely aware that you may be about to launch into a series of questions that have already been covered at length by previous boards. So if I do that, Chair, feel free to interject. There won't be any ego from myself. I think it's been a very interesting discussion so far, and some of the points I wanted to ask have already been covered. And it is interesting how we sort of look at resources and how resources are utilised. For example, my own ward, more generally in Inner Northwest, we have a serious and focused police, serious and police focus on antisocial behaviour. We wouldn't want to see that change because that's the key focus of our community's issues. But at the same time, we do have an urban speeding issue. We've had, in fact, quite a few areas in Leeds. We've had Connecting Leeds experimenting with active travel neighbourhoods to reduce rat running, and those have had mixed reception and a mixed impact. What's interesting in terms of behaviours is when people have seen what would be necessary to absolutely reduce rat running and by extension speeding, all of a sudden they're going, well, actually, those chicanes and those speed tables that we didn't like, they're not such a bad idea, are they, Councillor? It's interesting to see that an experiment for a worthy cause. We had to, during the pandemic, try to reduce rat running because my community is a victim of lots of commuting through it. And in fact, Hyde Park's used as a car park by a lot of people who work in the city centre. I wouldn't want to mention any higher education institutions and by name, but you know who I mean. And that's problematic for our community. But it's interesting how we can experiment and see how those impact on behaviours. But it did become clear during all this process that was a hardcore of drivers who really just don't want anything to impinge on their ability to speed. And colleagues from the police and the council have touched upon this, but already, so I don't want to repeat too much, but how do you think attitudes have changed in the last few years? And what do you think are the most effective methods or combination of methods to keep changing those attitudes? Because on the one hand, I've got constituents who, particularly when they've got young children at local schools, going, urban speeding is a terrible problem. You know, we're really interested in seeing what you can do. And the other, I have people who will tell me with a straight face, actually, there's no speeding in Hyde Park and Headingley, and any measures to restrict car movement are terrible and an infringement. So we've got these sort of diametrically opposed attitudes. So what, in your collective wisdom and experience, is the best way to navigate through this, Chair? Because my community is facing these challenges as well that we've seen from other members. Thanks.
Okay. No, I think if we're talking specifically about changing attitudes, my personal view, has always been around early intervention. So the earlier you can intervene to educate and prevent, the better. So naturally, as one of certainly from our inward facing policing strategy around road safety, we would always be looking for proactive opportunities at schools from the earliest age possible, because we know that parents, and I'm generalizing obviously, but parents are sometimes inclined to pay far more attention to what their child returning home from school with message of the day is, compared to a letter that pops through the letterbox from the police. So I suppose throughout this, we're emphasizing the partnership approach to it, the opportunities for better and continued and improved dialogue with everybody who can influence progress in this sphere. So for me, yeah, without labouring the point, early intervention is the clearest opportunity for me, but others might have different views on that, I'm sure.
Do you want me to come in?
Please, no.
Yeah, I'm just conscious we're an hour and 15 in, and we've maybe, I don't think we've had a sentence that hasn't mentioned the word speeding so far. I just want to just bring it a little bit down to the other issues that we face. Speeding is a very serious aspect of the KSIs, and it's one of the contributing factors. But so is not wearing your seatbelt. So is drink and drug driving, particularly drug driving amongst young people, is almost on a par now with driving with alcohol in systems. There's surveys done in a college in West Yorkshire where young people thought that cannabis was still legal or was legal after various movements between Class C and Class B drug. And using handheld devices, there's a clear loophole in legislation at the moment, which government are looking at. It was brought in when a mobile phone was used just to be used as a mobile phone. But a mobile phone is a computer now. You can book a flight on it. You know, you can FaceTime somebody. You can hold a Zoom conference meeting. That's not covered in the legislation. So sometimes the police are up against changing lifestyles amongst particularly younger people, and it's addressing, as Mr. Chester said, around the educational things. I appreciate last 18 months have been difficult getting into schools, colleges and universities, let's be honest with you, because universities are and colleges are where the 17-year-olds are starting to drive. My son's doing driving lessons now, and the fear of God in him is if he goes speeding, if he gets 6 points, he's going to get banned, you know. Contrary to that, there is also a definitive group of individuals that are using the road for criminal purposes. You know, we're not just talking here about the NHS worker that's a few minutes late for work, that's doing 35 and a 30. We're talking about specific individuals that are using the road network in high performance, and I'll use the inverted term, grey vehicles that are not registered to anybody, that are on a hire company agreement, that are driving through the county of West Yorkshire to be involved in criminality. And I think we maybe just need to focus a little bit around those issues that I've raised rather than just speeding.
sure whether I can follow that, but just the, I just want to say in terms of the work we've done in recent years, certainly the rollout of the 20 mph zones across the city, I think has been very visible and very, you know, we do need to get those residential speeds down. So we've got the speed limits now. We're looking, and it's in the papers, about where we don't have speeds low enough, and we're having to retrofit some traffic calming measures. But I think, you know, certainly that's one of the very, very visible and big, you know, something that's going to make a big difference in our localities. Beyond that as well, you know, we're wanting, and we will, as part of Vision Zero, look much more at behaviour change programmes, and they may be, you know, focused at active travel and getting people walking and cycling. But I think what we can see is that actually during the pandemic, when the road levels, the numbers of vehicles on the road dropped, then we also had a corresponding drop in our KSIs. And I think we really do need to get safe neighbourhoods where it's, you know, it's just unacceptable for people to be speeding through them. So I think that's where we're focusing moving forwards as well.
Okay, thank you. And I think Nick is quite right to bring us back to ground zero, that we're talking about more than just speeding through residential areas. Although it does beg the question that a lot of these criminals must feel that they're impregnable and untouchable because they can go out on the road together with others, not necessarily criminals, exceed the speed limit, and their chances of being stopped or penalised seem to be getting remoter and remoter. That's very clearly part of the psychology, and I realise it's a massive challenge in terms of enforcement. But Superintendent, you wanted to come back, and then Paul, thank you.
Yeah, and not to digress too much, I guess, because of the time available to us, but just as a point of reassurance, Nick clearly outlines a significant threat for us. However, our ANPR network back office team are superbly skilled in terms of identifying grey vehicles, recidivist drivers who we know and class as our highest risk offending drivers. We develop tasking packages, and they are allocated to our roads policing specialists to have a really good success rate in tracking them down and enforcing appropriately. So from a reassurance point of view, it's something we're clearly sighted on and well positioned to do something about.
Yeah, thank you. And later on in the report, although we probably won't get to it until the next session, it's how you actually flag up what's happening, because quite often people are not aware, even through social media, of all the really good enforcement work that the police do. And I suppose you need to get it out there so that people are aware that their concerns are being addressed. You know, it's not just kind of evaporated into the ether.
Yeah, there's a balance, and I think the unit that I've just mentioned, we wouldn't ever publicise that too heavily because we would compromise the capability that they offer us. But I do completely agree that, and in recent days, I've actually talked to colleagues about, and this is going to sound a bit wrong, but a more aggressive media strategy on behalf of what we do, because I think there are messages that need repeating repeatedly so that they make their mark. Whereas in the fast changing communication information digitally environment today, information can pass before your eyes and be replaced by something else within seconds. So we do need to think strongly about how we reinforce that message.
Thank you. Paul, I think you wanted to come back in.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Nick mentioned the grey keeper status vehicles, and I think I touched on them earlier. If I can just illustrate what we've now embraced as a real opportunity in West Yorkshire Police. When I started in my current role 4 years ago, each year we're enforcing around 170,000 traffic offences across West Yorkshire, 30% or so in the Leeds district. Unfortunately, because of these grey vehicles that were out there with no current keeper details, those that had been identified through safety camera activity, we were unable to take further action on. But what was more concerning was we were identifying patterns of quite deliberate behaviour where people were trying to frustrate the prosecution process by making false and fraudulent declarations on the notice of intended prosecution that's sent to the keeper, in inverted commas. There were clear links to organised criminal activity, including the supply of controlled drugs, child sexual exploitation, and other really serious criminal matters that were evidently linked to the vehicles that were tripping speed cameras. Now, clearly, the police activity around serious criminality is ongoing, but there was an untapped opportunity to actually use some of these attempts to pervert the course of justice that I was seeing in my world as a door opening exercise to further criminal intervention by the police. So I was very fortunate enough to have the support of the Chief Officer team in recognising the problem that I articulated, and they invested some investigation posts, some police officer posts in my team, just to focus specifically on the problem that we had around attempts to pervert the course of justice in traffic cases. What that's done is resulted in a number of significant convictions around conspiracy to pervert the course of justice, resulting in lengthy custodial sentences. And that's been another way of taking not just dangerous drivers off the roads, which it's been incredibly successful in, but also disrupting serious criminal activity. Now, what we're trying to do is be empathetic around the lower level of offender who's had a minor error of judgment and gone marginally over the speed limit, where we've got out of court disposals and driver education options, but also on that spectrum of outcomes, actually make sure that we make life as uncomfortable as possible for these really dangerous criminals who don't just embark on criminal activity in the traditional sense of crime, but actually in their day-to-day moving from A to B, present a real significant risk to road users. And we've all seen them, you know, the vehicle that's been souped up, the vehicles that are driven in convoy, very high-powered prestige vehicles in some occasions. These are the people that are now starting to feel some pain, and we're quite unapologetic about that approach.
Thank you for that, Paul. And obviously the people we're talking about consume a disproportionate amount of police resource. Yeah, we do appreciate that. Neil, did you want to come back on anything?
No, it's comprehensively answered, Chair. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Katie.
I think we've seriously moved on since the notes that I was going to ask questions on, so I'll come back at a different time.
Okay, thank you. Jonathan, you wanted to come back.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Conscious of the time. I think we spent a lot of time on enforcement, which is fine. We've learned a lot. But in some respects, once you get to that enforcement point, you've failed, because you know the speed or the parking or whatever is already taking place. So I was very interested in that approach that Paul was talking about, that layered approach where you start at, I suppose it's a bit like a pyramid, isn't it? You know, you start with the education and then the enforcement and the prosecution is the very last point, if all else fails. But my question on that is, yeah, that's fine. When can we have it, or how do we get it? And I think that comes back to the first point I was making, and you were making as well, Chair, is how do we actually get that and, what's the word, embed it in our communities, so that that's the approach we're having. And I think at the moment it's very piecemeal. It's very, every ward probably is, or every pact or every neighbourhood police team, depending on their resources and the personalities in the team and the ward councillors' involvement, are doing perhaps some of that, but in different ways and not joined up. So, for example, you were asking about community speed watch. We have some of those in my ward, supported by the PCSOs. And they're a bit of a movable feast. We have quite a lot of SIDS on lampposts. And we used to get data from them, but we don't anymore. Not because it's not available, it's just that the people who used to do it don't do it anymore. But I think that's part of the levels as well. Like a SID, I think a SID on a lamppost is more about speed awareness and speed enforcement. And I think the best way of reducing speed is have a SID on a lamppost and a child in every car, because I can guarantee that if you've got a child in your car and you're doing more than, and it flashes up red, they will tell you and you will slow down. So it's that about awareness, and it's those different levels. So they were really the points. So I think my question really is, or perhaps looking at the recommendations from the report, if we can look that far ahead, is about how we get that layered pyramid approach embedded in the community. And just a couple of specific questions, if I can, for Gillian. We've got this Appendix A, which has got 12 roads on, where you're saying you're doing additional work. How do roads get onto that list, and who's putting them on? And if we have in our wards roads which we think fit those criteria, how do we get them on so that we can do some more work? That's a very specific question. And the other specific question is, when we get data from the tubes, the road surveys that are done, and we present that to residents, or a traffic engineer comes along and presents it to residents, they say, oh no, you may think there's speeding along your road, but there's not, because look, the mean speed is only 24 miles an hour, spread over 24 hours. But when you actually look at it, you see, there's peaks where the speed, the actual speed in a certain band is 30 or 40 miles an hour. And that's at a time when perhaps children coming out of school, or it's, a dangerous time. But if you spread the speed out over the whole of the 24 hours, mean speed 24 miles an hour, 20 miles an hour limit, 10% plus 2, you haven't got a problem. And the problem is dismissed. And I think, coming back to an earlier point about use of data, we've got to get cleverer, I think, about using that data rather than just saying, oh, it's the mean out, the mean. And I just wonder whether we can look at that a bit more.
Thanks for that, Jonathan. Your second question is one that I think occupies us at every one of these meetings. Yeah. It's the fact that means and averages are fantastic, but it doesn't address that tiny minority of reckless and irresponsible idiots who are driving way above the speed limit. And that's a real challenge. So who wanted to come in? I think it was really a question initially for our highways colleagues.
Thank you, Chair. I think you're right, Councillor Bentley. We're not trying to suggest that in the first place that 24 miles an hour is an acceptable speed in the 20 mile an hour speed limit. I think a number of years ago, we looked at 85th percentile speeds, and now we're looking at average speeds, but that is as the guidance allows us. I think in reality, what we're really doing is prioritising based on limited resources. And, we do need to make sure that, because we're looking at putting in retrofitted traffic management, which is, it's expensive when we've got 20 mile an hour limits all across the city. So again, it's something we need to review, and we will be reviewing these sorts of issues under Vision Zero, but it's not something we'll necessarily get additional funds for. So we have got to there will be prioritisation going forwards. Just in terms of how you get on the list. So the traffic management team is undertaking these reviews. They are doing the speed surveys, and then they are providing prioritisation based on the criteria that you have outlined. So it's if you do believe that you've got a 20 mile per hour zone with an issue, then if you can send that to the traffic management team, they will do that review. And if you do meet the criteria, then it will go on a future programme.
Okay, fine. I've got Neil Buckley.
Thank you, Chair. I was going to bring this up at a later point, actually, but Nick mentioned the whole problem about mobile phones in cars. So if I can just ask a question about that. And just to kind of set the scene, really, I'm going to make a confession about that in a few seconds. But I've been driving a long time. Get your notebooks out. You can lock me up then if you like. But I've been driving since I was 17. And as we all know, in those days, cars had nothing in them. You might have a radio. That was it. It was a much more physical experience.
What did you say there? They were preceded by a red flag.
We'll be getting back to that, don't we?
Anyway, sorry, get on with it, Neil.
But the point I wanted to make was that I'll make the confession first. In 1996, my boss said to me, we're going to have a conference call, excuse me, on the telephone. I worked for a German company, and there was going to be my counterpart in the south, a chap from Germany, and the MD and me. And there were 3 of them in Abingdon, and I was driving to Manchester. And so I thought, well, I'll probably be able to stop at Hartshead services. And I got stuck in the traffic. So we were 4 lanes on the M62 doing up various speeds, and the phone rang. And of course, then it was a big, heavy thing, which gave you a tennis elbow. And I was on that, talking to all these people on a conference call, all kinds of different subjects, and Lord knows what about sales figures. And I've never done it since. And the reason I just told that story was that it seems to me every time we now pull up at traffic lights, the person next to us is on the phone. And they're either texting, they're very rarely speaking, they're doing something on that phone. And what can possibly be done about this? Because it just seems to go on and on and on. And in my view, people are talking about exceeding the speed limit, which is a bad thing. But often you get this erratic driving where all of a sudden somebody's doing 20 in a 40 limit. And they're on the phone and driving in the outside lane on the ring road at 40 miles an hour. And it just seems to be that nobody ever seems to enforce. You know, surely at one time the police would have pulled them over and said, get in the inside lane, and nobody seems to do it. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, there you go.
I think the point you raised there is a source of concern right across every police service in the UK. And that concern stems from some badly crafted legislation in relation to mobile phone use, but particularly a case, and the case in question is DPP versus a guy called Barretto. And I won't lead you through the judgment that came out of that case, other than to say what it created was a situation where it's not an offence just to have a phone in your hand whilst you're driving. And it actually places a burden of proof, which is the police responsibility, to establish that the phone at the time of the alleged offence was being used as a two-way communication device. Now that presents some real challenges. I have a professional responsibility for Operation Snap, which involves the public using a facility to upload footage of poor driver behaviour, including the circumstances that you described there, for our consideration for prosecution. Now, in light of the case involving Barretto, I have to evidentially prove that at the time that that phone was in the hand of the driver, it was being used as a two-way communication device. I cannot prove that to the required standard simply by somebody pointing their mobile phone at that individual and demonstrating that they had a phone in the hand. This is something that's been played out in the courts, and there is now a move in the in government, the Ministry of Justice, to redraft the legislation to make it much more practically applicable. But there is still an opportunity where the points to prove are established to prosecute a driver for an offence of being not in proper control of their vehicle. And that's the piece of legislation that we do use where the facts are made out to support the not being in control of the vehicle to the standard of a reasonably competent driver. So we do prosecute, but there is considerable frustration about the legislative framework that's available to us. So it's a make do amend solution using another bit of legislation that only carries 3 points instead of 6 points for the mobile phone offence. Less than perfect solution, but please rest assured, and colleagues here, I'm sure will support me in saying that officers will still stop people, even if they have no ability to use the primary offence. They will have recourse to either warning them or indeed alternative offences. but it's because of the advent of mobile phone technology, digital technology generally, the frequency where you and I as motoring members of the public see this type of behaviour is bound to increase because everybody has a handheld communication device in this modern age.
Yes, Superintendent.
And again, I suppose to underpin the fact that we are very much alive to it and are constantly thinking of ways to tackle it. We recent initiatives, so Paul's mentioned Operation Snap, but we have used it with a massive degree of success and an unmarked HGV actually. So some of our officers have the relevant license to take out an HGV on their own, which clearly gives them an elevated position, and they can obtain evidence of such offending far more easily than when you're at a ground level comparison in a similar type vehicle. So we are constantly thinking about how we achieve best evidence, how we can tackle that. But when you talk about prevention, it is quite a philosophical one really, because I think in the same way that speed awareness courses educate around the fact that you will probably reduce your travel time by 20 seconds if you do 40 miles per hour compared to 30 miles per hour over a set distance. People do operate along pressures of modern life in terms of, I need to get to destination X as quickly as possible. And in a similar way, I think in this digital era, people's lives are moving quite rapidly, aren't they? So they feel under this pressure to use these devices to expedite whatever it is, whatever aspect of their daily life they feel needs progressing. So in a similar way to the speed awareness, I think it's educating people that actually you can leave that Facebook inquiry holiday booking until you get to your safe destination rather than having to do it at the traffic lights. So the wider education, early intervention, preventative thing, again, I suppose comes to the fore, doesn't it?
Nick, do you want to come in?
Yeah, just to sort of round that off, in terms of the, I go back to the educational message. There's no more peer pressure than somebody tapping you on the shoulder as a child, or the passenger saying to you, put your phone down, you shouldn't be doing that, Dad. You know, and that goes back to what we're doing in schools, in colleges and universities. Gillian, I'm probably a bit of a broken record here, but we've got the matrix signs around the city centre, which I think, and I know there's been some IT issues, that I think we can use those signs and boards across the city centre to put messages on around using handheld mobile devices. I know the technology has not been there recently to do that, but we can switch that message between that and speeding and seat belts, and it can be that trigger point for somebody to look at it and think 6 points and £200 fine, you know, on the handheld device. If you get a new iPhone these days now and you connect it to your hands-free, it gives you an option to disable so many apps that effectively will just accept a phone call and nothing else. So again, it's about pushing it with young people who've got, you know, new iPhones that have got vehicles. Most vehicles these days will have a hands-free set. I'm not saying that using it hands-free is as safe as having no, you know, driving normally, because using hands-free still, I think the research says, poses a particular risk because you're still distracted by who you're talking to. But most vehicles that you see these days, certainly, you know, if it's been manufactured in the last 5 years, will have a hands-free kit. But motorists driving 30, 40,000 pound Audis and BMWs still are on the phone, and it's because perhaps they need somebody just to connect it to the Bluetooth. And I'm not saying that's an excuse. I'm just saying there is an educational thing here around, you know, getting motor manufacturers involved in this. You know, when somebody picks up the new vehicle, you know, getting it linked up to the vehicle, disabling the apps like Facebook and WhatsApp. So literally you can take a phone call and that's it.
Thanks for that. There's no reason why, when we come to our recommendations, that some of them might be targeted at a more strategic level, either through the LGA or through the agency of our MPs, if we're talking about changes to the law. So it would be really useful, Paul, if you could share with us the sort of amendments or new legislation that's required to address, you know, to bring reality up with experience, the legislation up with reality. So I think that would be very useful to feed into what we're doing. Neil, do you want to come back?
Very briefly, Chair, if I can. I'm a bit of a poacher turned gamekeeper on this. So I think, and our Chair probably agrees, I do not think that mobile phones should be in cars, not just with the driver anyway, passengers is another matter. But just very, very briefly, about 2 years ago, my wife and I went to a wedding in Wetherby, and we came home about midnight. My wife was driving. She went to an area which I don't think there should have been a camera, but we couldn't be bothered going back. So she took the driving course. She was doing 36 miles an hour. She got a ticket and a fine, or she got a course. She was over, okay, midnight, nothing about. And yet she could text to her heart's content on the dual carriageway, and the chances of being caught effectively are zero. So I think the point's made, Chair. Thank you.
No, I think we've all followed drivers at 20 miles an hour in 40 mile an hour zones, knowing full well that they're texting away. But yeah, perhaps the police colleagues can take all those offences into consideration. Neil. Moving on to Jonathan Taylor.
Thanks, Jay. I think I'm not the only one shocked at some revelations at the driving habits of the Buckley household, but
yeah,
and I'm yeah, exactly. And I am really keen to get onto section 3.
Yeah, and I know why, and so am I.
To move it on, but just going back to Councillor Bentley's point and to Gillian's reply, we've got the tables in front of us here about the projects and further works and the costs. And I do have to say it frustrated me, you know, because I mean the costs do all rack up quite quickly. And just to give a point, and I could give further examples, but there are 2 potential planning applications coming for Low Lane in my ward. One which is a development of flats, and another which is a supermarket. And traffic have come with this nonsense proposal to get money out of the developer, out of these 2 developers, potentially up to 140k, to go onto a roundabout scheme that our highways engineer estimates is going to cost 3 times that amount. And after 10 years, these developers can pull it back. That is a source where we can get funding for these types of things. And I think you need to take that back to colleagues in traffic when they're looking at planning applications, that they need to talk to members, they need to talk to the police, need to talk to other invested partners, because coming up with something at a desktop level, which sounds like a good idea, which has got no practical chance of ever being delivered before the developer can claw that significant amount of money back, is to me absolutely outrageous. And I only raise that because I see Councillor Bentley brought it up, Gillian's reply, and I see the amounts in here. Thank you, Chair.
No, and I think it's a very valid point, Jonathan, and one that we've addressed before. To some extent, we need to be asking why planning are part of the partnership, or whether they are, and what resources they can bring to it. I suspect one of the other problems, though, is that if you require developers through Section 106 agreement to do something which is very expensive, they're going to cry viability and object to the amount involved. So I think there are lots of different dynamics.
If I may, just on that point, I mean, I do accept what you're saying, and the whole project which I mentioned is something to do with the Woodside roundabout, but as our engineer estimated, it was going to cost over £500,000 to get the pedestrian access all right, and these 2 developers were contributing towards something that is probably never going to happen. Whereas that funding, you know, we see the amount of speed humps, we know that there are pedestrian crossings needed on low lane. We've only got the refuges at the moment. This is where the money should be spent, and we should be asking for it. And you know, it's just this is a top up to the budget that traffic has, and it needs to be used in a similar sense, I think, and not just thought, oh well, we'll put something together and get it through planning, and then, you know, if it happens, it happens. If we get a windfall, then fantastic, we'll do it, and if not, then it goes back to the developer. Thank you.
I think you're right to raise the point, and I'm sure that lots of ward members have got frustrations at an even lower level when schemes come through and the highways measures that are recommended as part of the planning process seem to be pretty flaccid and limited. And I think we need to ensure that highways and planners are being as robust as possible in terms of road safety measures. So I think you flagged it, but we'll take that as a comment, but I'm sure we will be revisiting it. I've got Councillor Hussain next.
Chair, thank you very much. I'm coming on to the mobile phone, to be honest with you, right? And I think it is the right opportunity to speak because of, if we look into the picture of Leeds City Council's a badge holder for private hire and the Hackney carriage is more than between 5,000 to 6,000. But I can say 95% every single firm, doesn't matter they are a Hackney carriage or private hire, they're in the computer system. And they're all working like every single driver for the Uber, they don't provide to the PDAs, they're on the mobile phone. And every single job comes through to the mobile phone. And many others, they're providing to the drivers a PDA. PDAs look like to me, not exactly the phone, it's not much different from the phone, right? But when it's the jobs are coming onto the system, doesn't matter if it's a mobile phone, it's an Uber driver or any other, they have to touch to accept the job. Otherwise, that job is, if it's no one single chair, like if it's one driver's Uber, I think it's nearly 1,000 driver chair. And if nobody touched the phone to accept the job is not going to nowhere at all. It's staying into the system where is the head office of the company, right? But I was looking at very clear onto the government website. It's not very clear. Can they touch yes or not? Right? Yes, I can understand, and I'm sure that some of them might be drivers don't understand, but they're not holding the phone in the hand. They're putting it to the stand. And whenever the job is there, they're clicking it. And each driver, when ending the job, they have to click as well. Right? So I think we needed to look at this one chair as well, to be honest with you, as across the city. And also this is not only that issue. If the drivers go booked to touching it and go guilty, the two licensing committee members in here who signed to the Leeds City Council, it's a new policy by the Leeds City Councils. If it's any drivers go guilty onto the mobile phone, his badge is going for 5 years. Because first stage is between police and the drivers. The drivers soon go guilty, doesn't matter in the magistrate, crown court or stairway go guilty. Then it's a stairway matter between the driver who go guilty to the Leeds City Council vehicle licensing issue. So it's, to be honest with you, I asked my lawyer as well. So he was saying it's not clear. But I think that's one of the key thing is, it's 5,000 to 6,000. This is a very large number, was very valuable for the Leeds City Councils as a business-wise. Doesn't matter it's a night, providing a service to the community. They're really, the key bone. So I think that's other things we needed to look at, Chair, where we are exactly. And that is not just only for the Leeds issue, right? That is across the country. And we're just talking about the Leeds because everything is moving into the new things, new technologies, right? And without, this all to the PDA, no chance even a one firm can, provide a service to the Leeds resident.
Would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, it's a valid point. I often say when people ask me this question, would you do it on your driving test? And most people say, well, no, I wouldn't do it on my driving test. So why would you do it while you're driving? So you're right. You've got obviously Uber drivers. Expand that to Deliveroo and Just Eat, which everybody's been using during COVID, and driving vehicles having to use their, to either accept or decline the delivery or the job or whatever. I'm sure members of the public here and who are complaining about road safety would say, and I would say they shouldn't be using their mobile phone device for anything. It might be they could pull over at the side of the road or stop the vehicle in a safe way to accept those jobs, but not while they're driving, because that momentary glimpse. However, the legislation at the moment is not fit for purpose. It's very unclear legislation. It was supposed to come in early 2021. It's still, I think, going through various stages through the Houses of Parliament. Obviously, as we're probably aware, that it's not in at the moment, but the advice would be that they shouldn't be using their mobile phone, but the legislation is particularly weak in relation to that. So for us to enforce it, we would have to revert to, as Paul said, not being in proper control of the vehicle. So for example, somebody eating a banana or drinking a bottle of water or putting lipstick on in a wing mirror or something like that, or lipsil or whatever, that would also be covered by that same legislation. So again, you see people drinking a coffee on the way to work, or having a bottle of water, or that's all covered by not being in proper control of the vehicle.
Thank you, Chair. I favour not getting too hung up about specifically mobile phones. What we should be talking about, and certainly in terms of Vision Zero methodology, is promoting safe behaviours. And this is the fundamental difference, really, between our historic, traditional reactive approach to casualty reduction to the notion of casualty prevention as espoused under Vision Zero. We talk about the safe systems methodology, and that's not, well, it's a significant departure. It's a culture shift away from re-engineering a road after 2 people have died in a collision because of A, B and C factors being present. So in terms of our communication and engagement plan around safe behaviours going forward under Vision Zero, I'm pretty confident that our delivery plan is going to reflect not specifically mobile phones, but every form of behaviour that can reduce the competency of the person behind the wheel. And that might be mobile phones, it could be pressing the sat nav, it could be driving with your pet dog on your lap, which is a behaviour that you see quite frequently. So it's all those things, and that's why I think safe systems, Vision Zero offers such a massive opportunity here in West Yorkshire.
Okay, thank you. Paul, you wanted to come back in again, and then I'm going to move on to section 3.
I'll be very brief, Chair. It was really about what you just said about advertising the unsafe behaviour. Do you think there is some evidence that graphic pictures of, I recall some time ago, someone being involved in an accident, and it was a fatal, and the phone was embedded in their face, and those sort of pictures do bring it home to people. And some years ago I went to Australia, and they used to have a picture of a crashed car on a billboard saying, "Wake up, you're entering a village," because they have a big problem with people falling asleep with the long distances, and they wanted to alert people to waking up when they came to villages. And I just wondered whether that sort of advertising of the consequences of actions, and it's not just around mobile phones, but speed and that sort of thing, were worth doing, because councils all have money at their disposal that they could use on that sort of thing. And you did relate to the messaging boards that we have, but it's writing which is flashing up, not particularly the graphic images. And I just wonder whether you had an opinion about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I would step back from the use of graphic imagery, but impactive imagery and impactive sound. And very recently, through the West Yorkshire Partnership, we've delivered some radio advertising around a number of themes using properly directed and produced, quite impactive scripts, which brought home some really sobering messages on casualty prevention themes. And that's something that I'd be really keen to develop in Leeds and elsewhere as we move forward, because every opportunity we have to reinforce the key messages around casualty prevention with the public, safe behaviours, safe people, etc., it is something that really excites me, to be honest.
And just to add to that, I think that has to be a continued investment, because I think as graphic as imagery has been used in years and decades gone past, if it's there as a one-off, it quickly becomes wallpaper, for want of a better phrase, that people are desensitized to. So it has to be a constantly developing and evolving thing.
Okay, thank you. Right, I'm going to move on to section 3. Are there any questions? And Jonathan, I knew you'd be first in the queue on this that we haven't already covered in the previous discussions. So I'm going to bring in Jonathan and anticipate that he's going to raise issues relating to safety cameras and enforcement.
Thank you,
And then
Chair.
I'll bring in Katie.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, page 27, 3.2.5. I actually think Mr. Jeffrey might have just answered my first point, because I was going to ask what activities are reinvested with the surplus in Leeds, and if we can have that details of the information, if possible. The selection criteria in the appendix, if I can ask as an example on fixed, general fixed cameras, would all three points need to be met for a fixed camera to be installed? And have any sites been approved in Leeds fairly recently? And page 28, moving over onto page 29, 3.6.4. It does always feel to me this policy has devolved, and we as elected members have been excluded from the process of reevaluating this criteria. The recent readoption of the status quo on the criteria by the partnership, for me, is just a non-starter, particularly from what we're reading from colleagues in highways, some of whom were on the board there to make that decision. What they've said in their letter to the DFT doesn't correlate with how they voted on that reassessment. The West Leeds Dispatch website yesterday reported that over 2,000 motorists were caught speeding down Stanningley Road in Armley over a 40-day period up until mid-July this year. This partnership is supposed to be a local approach, but it does feel just as remote as Whitehall to those of us on the ground who need this equipment to be installed, when we can't even respond to instances like 2,000 motorists speeding in a 40-day period. So as a starter, I'd like some answers to those, please. Thank you.
Okay, Paul, and then I think maybe Gillian may well want to come in.
Thank you. I'm going to start with a little bit of context around speed camera enforcement in West Yorkshire. So West Yorkshire Police, myself, Mr. Chesters, are responsible for enforcement on behalf of the partnership using static and mobile speed cameras. Please, when we're talking about speed camera enforcement, put to one side all your knowledge about Pro Laser. The framework around which you can use static and mobile speed cameras within the context of the partnership operation is governed by a whole different set of legislation and DFT guidance. So in 2020, West Yorkshire Police, on behalf of the partnership, using those safety cameras, brought about prosecutions in respect of 192,000 motorists in West Yorkshire for speed and red light violations. So that's 192,000 offences of excess speed and failing to stop for a red light on the urban and strategic road network, the motorways. That is the second highest figure nationally, second only to the Metropolitan Police. Now, the use of speed cameras polarises public and political opinion. I know that from personal experience. Depending on who you're talking to, they want a speed camera on every street corner, or conversely, not in my backyard, because you're just putting it there to capture an innocent member of the public and supplement your budgets. So let's just explore that point first. Speed cameras attract no grant money from the government. They have to be self-sustaining. So we have, as a partnership in West Yorkshire, retained the deployment guidance that was in place prior to the devolution of speed camera operations to local authorities and police. It used to be under the initial pilot in the early 2000s, supported by government grant, which allowed for the purchase and support of back office functions. And under the initial pilot, cameras could only be placed when it met the criteria that's outlined in the DFT Circular 1 of 2007. When that was devolved and we formed a partnership in West Yorkshire to deliver speed camera operations, the partnership retained that deployment criteria. Why did they do that? And I hasten to add, I wasn't around at the time, but what it does give you is justification and necessity for where you put your speed cameras. So we can say categorically in West Yorkshire that we comply with the guidance, and wherever we put a speed camera, it's because we have an evidence base of poor speed compliance and the history of collisions. Am I entirely happy with that? No, I'm not. And neither is the partnership. The guidance doesn't give us a proactive opportunity as it stands today to put cameras where there is some indicative evidence of new and emerging risk that falls short of that high risk threshold. And this is a source of some frustration. So wind forward, or wind back if you like, to 2020, when Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary, Fire and Rescue prepared their inspection around roads policing. It's referenced in the pack that you have this morning. The inspection report there examined everything that is the world of roads policing, including safety camera enforcement. And there were two relevant recommendations in that quite far-reaching National Inspectorate document. The first basically encouraged all chief constables to ensure that the partnership, or indeed some forces operate unilaterally, were compliant with DFT Circular 1 of 2007. So we were, as a partnership, compliant with that point. The second, and I think this was really helpful and significant recommendation, recommendation number 8, said that the DFT, in conjunction with the Home Office, should undertake a review and refresh of that DFT document 1 of 2007. And that was actually music to our ears in West Yorkshire, because we recognise the limitations of the current deployment criteria. But what I'm really keen to ensure that we retain is some evidence base, a lower threshold. But what we can't afford to have, in my opinion, and I think this is shared by the partnership, is a totally random approach to where we stick cameras, because we will lose the public confidence in us, in our aim to try and tackle true risk. And it will play into the hands of the tabloids that like to peddle the cash cow type argument. And we see that on a regular basis. So once that recommendation landed, the partnership, through myself, made contact with the DFT and said, look, this is West Yorkshire's position. We have embarked on some preliminary work around a lower level threshold, which will give us greater reach in terms of where we're able to put speed cameras. On the back of that contact, and I'm grateful for the support that Gillian's letter gave from a Leeds City Council perspective, I then contributed directly to the working group that has started the ball rolling on that review exercise down at the DFT. The latest update I have is that the first draft will be published, will be released to the working group for comment before Christmas, with a view to the final revised version being in place in spring 2022. Now, our position, and I want to re-emphasize this, is that we want to retain a high-risk criteria, but we also want to extend the reach of our deployment strategy by a second tier which reflects emerging risk locations. So your sites of concern, for example. In retaining those criteria, both sets of criteria, we will retain the integrity of the operation that we're doing, we'll better address risk, and going back to an earlier conversation this morning, the use of speed cameras is not the panacea for all things speeding. It should be a last resort to go down the enforcement route. And through the adoption of Vision Zero principles, what we will see is that cradle to grave problem solving approach, which is evidence-based and delivered across all the stakeholders. So I'm eagerly awaiting the first draft of the revised legislation, and I sincerely hope it reflects this need to extend the reach of our cameras. But going back to the point of funding, we have to self-sustain the operation. I'm allowed under the National Cost Recovery Model to recover an element of the speed awareness course fees to pay for the cameras themselves and the back office running costs to process those violations that we detect. I need to be cost neutral. If I can't deliver that, well, we won't be able to sustain the existing operation. So when I look at some forces that have thrown caution to the wind and basically run a mobile only operation with no static speed cameras, they get a huge amount of public backlash because they're putting those cameras in locations which have a questionable risk identified. I don't want to turn around to the public of West Yorkshire and undermine all the hard work that's gone on in our very methodical approach to identify high-risk sites. What I want to do is expand the scope in a controlled way. Sorry, has that covered most of the points?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I will bring Jonathan back in, but that is extremely helpful, that insight into the current process. Have you got any feel for the process from now on? Not necessarily timescale, because you're just waiting and twiddling your thumbs to get this first draft, but will it be consulted upon? Will it be put out more widely? Is that the intention, or is that a question you can't answer? Because I think going back to your initial point, my worry is that this issue has become very politicised. And there are some political parties who are very quick to condemn others for being anti-motorists. And I think it's an issue where there has to be cross-party consensus. Otherwise, we'll just come up against, you know, that issue. And as you say, the red tops and those who caricature it as a cash cow.
The DFT will have their own consultation on the paper before it's signed off by the Minister for Transport. Clearly, the partnership will examine the document and take a view on any feedback that needs to fall out of that first draft. I agree with you about the risks of politicising speed enforcement. And in many respects, it's almost a shame that the restrictive guidance that we've had to work under has been so long in its revision, because police officers can enforce either covertly or overtly wherever they want and at any time of day. So it really makes little sense to me to have this very overbearing, very rigid set of criteria when, you know, as I've just said, police officers can, in theory, well, they're very much unfettered around their deployment in communities. So who knows what the guidance is going to look like and to what degree they're going to relax it. My worry is that they sit on the fence and it becomes a, well, this is guidance, but you can actually do what you want locally. I don't think that's good from a legitimacy point of view, because you will get disparity across forces and districts. And I want to ensure that we put the public first in protecting them, and also retain confidence in that as a legitimate policing tactic.
Okay, thank you, Paul. I'll come back to Jonathan and then bring Katie. And Jonathan, I'm sure you want to come back on this.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Sorry, Mr. Jeffrey, I didn't get an answer on the criteria itself. If we were looking at general fixed cameras, if all 3 points within the criteria need to be met before a new camera is installed, and how many have been installed recently. I do understand what you're saying, but we make the policy. It's down to us at this end of the table to make the policy, and it's down for us to deal with the public ramifications of whether or not. I got an email just the other day saying, put your base to one side and support new speed cameras. And I had to reply saying, I have put my base to one side. And a lot of my base now want to see more speed cameras. And a lot of my base, who originally said they hated 20-mile-per-hour zones, want 20-mile-per-hour zones because they're spending more time at home. They can work from home, all these sort of things. And they hate to see speeding vehicles whizzing past their properties. So on that side of things, it's for us to deal with the political fallout with each other, with the public, and negotiate that more so than I think officers. Funding, you've mentioned funding. We've mentioned that we fund SIDS. We've mentioned that we fund that we have funded other measures as well through money that's available to us locally. And I know that these sort of cameras are more expensive than the other devices that are available. But again, that's decisions that we have to make. And I think the aspiration that you're saying that we want to change the criteria but when the opportunity to do so regionally here in West Yorkshire was presented to us, you did just go for the status quo and let's keep it as it is. There was no change. This is what our highways officers reported to me, that in the review, you've readopted the criteria that's been there for the last 10 plus years. And where the cameras are placed, I mean, I've not submitted it previously, but this is Horsforth. So we've got New Road side here and we've got Broadway, and I'll turn it around and it displays there. We've got 5 or 6 cameras along New Road side, and we've got none along Broadway here. And there have been no fatal accidents on New Road side in the past 7 or 8 years that I've been in Horsforth. And we've had, and we're going to hear from next month, the mother of a young lad who died in a speeding vehicle, who was one of 4 boys that died. And there was a further 3 fatalities in that accident. And the only change that we've seen on that stretch of road are the flowers that she plants every year, or places of the year at the site of the accident. And it just feels wrong, and it's devolved to us, and it should be devolved to us. And we've been completely excluded from this entire process. And I do feel it's unacceptable. And that if this draft is coming out before Christmas, it needs to be made available to Leeds officers, and Leeds officers need to make it available to us on this scrutiny board at the very least, to look at it, discuss it, and then provide our recommendations back to you so that you can adequately represent our views, and our views represent the views of our constituents. So there's a little bit to go out in there as well, Chair. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. I think you make some very cogent and pertinent points, which we have rehearsed previously, but as members, we get more and more frustrated that we're perhaps not exercising as much discretion as we can do. So I don't know if the figures that Jonathan's asked for, that Councillor Taylor's asked for, are immediately available. If not, then you can feed them back to us between this meeting and the next meeting. He asked for a number of cameras that have been commissioned. Could I ask if any cameras have been decommissioned? Because again, there is a lot of exchanges from time to time on social media that, you know, there's no film in a particular camera, in inverted commas. So yeah, perhaps if colleagues from the police, but also from highways can address those points.
Okay. So the criteria as it stands at the moment in the national DFT guidance that we work to is applied by each of the local authorities, highways teams. So the police don't have any role in that. The identification of sites is a local authority highways matter. The feasibility of using cameras at those sites when they are identified is something we engage on together, because there are factors that we have to take into consideration around the feasibility of the use of a fixed or indeed mobile camera. So in terms of camera enforcement in the Leeds district, currently we have 19 high-risk mobile enforcement sites and a total of 118 static sites. We have a number of those sites that we rotate cameras around housings. So we do that for a variety of reasons. Some of the old technology cameras that were wet film cameras that required developing are in the process of modernisation. Some cameras, through traffic surveys, we've established that we've actually got a good compliance level, so we never put a camera in them. Clearly, we don't make that public because the physical presence of a yellow box at the side of the road has a preventative aspect to it. In terms of newly commissioned cameras, I can research it, but being pretty familiar, I can think of 3 cameras in the last 12 months that we've upgraded in the Leeds district. It's an ongoing process. Highways will identify a site. They will then engage ourselves as the enforcement body and the engineering lead, which is led by Kirklees local authority on behalf of the partnership, and we'll come together to look at the feasibility of installation. I have to say, I hear what you're saying, and with respect, I have to disagree around some of your comments. We as the enforcement body, West Yorkshire Police, are working to a national guidance document. We do that on behalf of the partnership, and it was the partnership that said given the recommendations contained in the HMIC FRS inspection document, we should continue doing that until that document is refreshed. There was no dissent around the partnership table. We were seeking a review. The tipping point that's precipitated that review has come about after the publication of the inspection document. We've done some preliminary work, which hopefully will have been recognised by the DFT. We did that work locally and developed a set of criteria that had a lower threshold. But we took a collective view as a partnership that it would be foolhardy to press ahead and go unilaterally with the introduction of a lower threshold when last year's inspection document was saying chief constables should stick to one of 2007 guidance, and in the same breath they were encouraging the DFT to take a look at it at a national level. So, you know, that was a recommendation to our chief constable. I had the support of the partnership in sticking with our adherence to, albeit the old guidance, and it is outdated for all the reasons I've touched upon. But it's very much an operational enforcement decision where you put speed cameras. And I think we have to be led primarily by what the national guidance is telling us. And that allows us to retain legitimacy of purpose for the use of safety cameras. Whereas if it's just a case of who shouts loudest that gets a camera on their street, I think you start to undermine the whole operation using speed cameras and play into the hands of those people who would rather see them all dug up and there being a free-for-all. But that's my personal opinion.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Julian, I don't know if you want to come in as well. And just one other question. Could you give us some idea of the average cost of installing speed cameras at any particular location? Paul?
Yes. Speed camera installation costs between £26,000 and £40,000, depending on which camera type we use and the location, the power supply, the degree of roadworks that we need. But that's only part of the story, because what you have to factor in are the running costs in the back office operation that we have to sustain. So to operate the 236 cameras that I have staffing resources which amount to £1.8 million and general running costs annually of just shy of £900,000. I've done some comparative work, and the back office function that we operate in West Yorkshire per 100 offences that we process is the leanest operation nationally. So in terms of value for money, I'm confident that it is efficient and effective. We have increased the offence processing by in excess of 70,000 offences over the last 2 years, with an increase of just 5 processing officers. So please don't just think this is about buying a bit of hardware at the roadside. There are recurrent costs and people costs involved. And of course, for every violation that you get, there are a number of options on how that's disposed of. One is a speed awareness course. The second option would be a conditional offer, £100 fine and 3 points, or indeed a court appearance. And again, my team prosecuting court, stand up in front of the bench and deliver those prosecutions. So there's a real end-to-end process that needs financing. So just buying a camera for the money I talked about is part of the equation, not all of it.
Okay, thanks very much. Gillian, I'll let you come back.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to say really that, we do take this very seriously, and we are, I suppose we are waiting at the moment. We do have our hands slightly tied for the outcome of the review. We're very supportive of getting additional cameras and additional sites. Personally, I don't sit on the safety camera partnership, so I haven't had a say in this so far, but we are represented by Nicholas Hunt, who was intending to be here today, but he's unwell, unfortunately. So he could have offered a bit more information from the Leeds perspective. But, I did write the letter. I am, very supportive of getting the criteria relaxed so that we can, get additional speed camera locations in Leeds.
Okay, Jonathan, I'm going to let you come back on this one.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Sorry.
Oh, no, it was the raised hand. Jonathan.
Thank you. This is my last point for the moment, because I'm keen to hear from other colleagues on the board as well. And actually, I'm just going to ask my question, which I haven't had an answer to yet. Do all 3 points on for a new fixed camera in the criteria need to be met before it's installed?
It's one for highways, I'm afraid. They apply the criteria. So I don't routinely get involved in that aspect of it. It's the enforcement that there will be a police responsibility.
Okay, and if Gillian can't answer that, then we'll have the information. We'll ask the question. Nick can get back to us between meetings, and I will certainly exercise latitude for it to be picked up at the next meeting, Jonathan, if you so wish. Katie.
Thank you. I'm going to section 3.2.4, and there's in the last paragraph a mention of school streets. So my question is, has there been time for an evaluation of that strategy yet? And if so, is there any evidence that it has improved safety around schools?
My understanding is that that's ongoing at this very moment.
Hi, Councillor. Just to let you know that we are carrying out evaluation at the moment. So we've got 14 sites that are a trial, and they have been installed as a temporary TRO for 18 months. So part of that evaluation is to identify what's worked and what hasn't worked so well, and to try and find a way to further support them. So one of the issues that we have with school streets is the enforcement and the ability to enforce, and that seems to be the biggest issue for my team in terms of correspondence, and also for parking services to enforce. So I think it would be wise for us to carry out that evaluation, identify sites where we think they would work really well and don't require that high level enforcement, and take those forward. Now that might not therefore meet your expectations, and that we would put them in areas where there needs to be a lot of enforcement. So it's a really difficult one. They're working really well. We're getting great feedback from residents and from schools, that there are just some enforcement issues that we need to deal with. Now there are some things that could help us along the way with that, and one is there is a review of the moving vehicle enforcement by DFT at the moment, and that could really help us with that issue. So at the moment we're carrying out the evaluation of the 14 sites, and we won't take any further school street sites forward until we've made a decision.
Thank you, Katie.
Yeah, just I'm fully aware of the issues around enforcement, because we have one in my ward where there are those issues. But I would like it to be a success if we can resolve those problems, because the feedback from the school is that they want it to stay, and the feedback from a lot of the residents is that they want it to stay. So just a quick question, when do you think you'll be in a position to report back on that?
Yeah, we're hoping the evaluation, which has been carried out by an organisation called Living Streets, who are really supportive of the school streets movement, and we hope to have that by around about December. That coincides with decision making that we need to make about the TRO, whether we make it permanent or if we need to come up with something else.
Okay, thanks very much. We have one in my ward where I'm also a governor, and it's been a mixed sort of response from local residents and the school, but yeah, we're waiting for the evaluation. Before we move on, I've just got one question under section 3, and it relates to 3.2.1, the West Yorkshire Police Roads Policing Unit. And I just noticed the second paragraph under that indicates that officers undertook enforcement activity across West Yorkshire in respect of 27,000 etc. offenders, compared to just under 20,000 in the previous 12 months. And I just wanted to ask police colleagues, Is that because there's more resource available? Is it because there's been more of a focus and a priority? Or is it because the pandemic period has given greater opportunities for that deployment? Or is it a mixture of 2 or 3 of those?
Probably the latter. I think COVID and the pandemic period has clearly impacted on everything ranging from KSI incidents to enforcement stats. I would like to think that with a tighter focus around priorities and as I've already mentioned in this discussion, the increased national focus on roads policing and enforcement activity, that they're taking a clear steer from that, no pun intended. There aren't any additional resources in that, I have to say. So those 120 officers have been in place for some time now with no additionality to that. Does that address all your points?
Yeah, I think it does. And I've just got one question which perhaps you can answer after the meeting in correspondence. It's a breakdown of where the type of offence and where it took place in terms of location, district, etc. Not wanting to know every street, obviously, but just to get a feel for the issues that have been addressed and where that's been. I've set the ball rolling. No, it's okay. Jonathan and then, well, Jonathan T and then Jonathan B.
Thanks, Chair. I'm grateful for the time you've given me on this, but it's just one quick question for Gillian, which I don't think I got an answer to earlier. And that's, will you share the first draft of the criteria mentioned from DFT with us, as I say, at least to this board when it comes before Christmas, please?
Yeah, I think that's when it's made public rather than necessarily when, because I mean, Paul, you've been involved in this process, haven't you? So yeah, I think we need to put a marker down that we would like to see that back. I suspect we might need more than just one more session on these issues, but I'm in the hands of the board. Okay, Jonathan Bentley.
Just getting back to safety cameras, and it's just a view really. If anyone's got it from the police or the or Paul. About 20 years ago, I was in Nottingham, and average speed cameras were a bit of a novelty then, but they were on a road that I used to use regularly from the town centre to the motorway, equivalent to a ring road. And it did have a huge effect on speed, and not only speed, but on congestion, because people weren't rushing from one bit to the next or rushing from one camera to the next. I just wanted views on that really, use of average speed cameras.
Yes, as the enforcement lead, I'm a huge fan of average speed cameras. We are actively exploring the use of those across West Yorkshire. One of the sort of health warnings, if you like, that goes hand in hand with those types of cameras is the risk of displacement and creating rat runs where people can circumvent the length of road that you've installed the average speed cameras on. But absolutely a great technological asset where they've been employed. I mean, we do have some average speed limits at the moment on the strategic road network, the motorway and A road network. And I would like to see those being used appropriately on the urban environment as well.
Follow up, and thanks for that. And I share your views on those, to be quite honest. Would it involve any other legislation or any other criteria if you use those rather than the cameras that we use now, the safety cameras we use now? Is it just a question of changing policy on getting funding?
No. Once the criteria is in place, be it the existing one or the refreshed one, it's about us using the right tools for the right scenario. So it will be very much an on-the-ground discussion between the highways engineers that have identified the location that needs safety camera enforcement, and a discussion with ourselves and the engineering lead to ensure that we get the right solution, be it mobile, static, average, etc.
Sorry, Chair, just last question.
The last.
It is very much the last one. Is that aspiration that you have, is that recorded anywhere? Is there a document that actually says this is a view, or is it just your personal view at this point?
No, it's a view of the partnership as a whole.
Yeah.
We've talked about, for For example, the former Gatso cameras, which were wet film cameras that are now being phased out. We have lengths of road that are covered by multiple Gatso cameras that we wouldn't seek to replace one for one with digital cameras. A, on a cost basis, but B, there's a better solution in the introduction of an average speed camera on that length. So you get rid of 5 cameras and just have 2. So you're cutting down on street furniture. You get a better effect. You know, you don't get people camera surfing, stepping on the accelerator the minute they're out of the range of the camera, or if they do, they are caught. So yeah, we recognise in the right setting the benefits of using average speed alongside the other solutions that are available to us.
Yeah, no, thank you for raising that, Jonathan, because I think notwithstanding any of the negatives, I think most of us would probably be fans of average speed cameras for just the reason that Paul mentioned, you know, the speeding, the heavy braking, the rapid acceleration once they've got past the camera point. Okay, so I think I can move us on to the section 4 on road casualties. And I think actually, although this does update some of the figures and present them in a slightly different way, we are pretty conversant with the figures, and it's the reason why we've been keen to hold this inquiry in the first place. That's not to prevent members from raising any questions or making any comments on this section. But I think it is a useful starting point, and I think obviously has to be seen in the context that Lindsay mentioned much earlier on. So agenda item 5, enforcement activity. Now, talking about enforcement, again, I'm not going to rule out any questions, but I think we have, during the discussion on the previous sections, touched upon most of the issues that certainly arose in my mind on this. But again, if members have got any comments or questions to make on this section, please feel free to do so. Okay, that brings us on to section 6, and I think those who have been assiduous readers of our terms of reference and what we planned for the second section, most of this section relates to items that we've identified for the next part of the inquiry. However, 6.1 doesn't, so I don't know if there are any issues that anyone wants to raise in that, but everything after that 6.2 onwards, I think, falls into the second part of the inquiry as we've laid it out. Jonathan.
Thank you, Chair. I do actually just quickly want to move to 6.7 and just ask traffic if they know, if I'm right, that reviews on crossing patrols are done annually, and how many current vacancies there are at the moment across Leeds. Thanks.
Hi, Councillor. My understanding is that the reviews are done, it's not an annual review, it's done by request. So if a school would like to have a review carried out, then it would be, the onus is almost on the school to contact the CEL team. It's not something that sits within highways at the moment. So we don't have a lot of say on that process. It is something that I would like to address as part of Vision Zero. I think there are some gaps there, and I don't think it works so well, because if the school, well, if the criteria isn't met, they're not offered any additional assistance, and that's where my team and perhaps highways could even come into play. So I don't know an awful lot more to answer your question, but I can certainly get back to you, and it is something that we would like to review as part of Vision Zero.
Yeah, thank you for flagging that up, Jonathan. I'd also add to officers and Becky that 6.5 refers fairly modestly to annual pedestrian crossing review. I think this is another issue that exercises us as members individually as well as members of the board, and perhaps we need a little bit more information about the criteria. We've talked about the criteria for speed cameras, but in terms of the local communities, probably we get more concern about the criteria applied for the provision of crossings than we do for speed cameras. So perhaps we could do with slightly more information on the criteria. There is some brief reference to some of the sites that are being looked at, but certainly I think that's an issue that the board members would want to look at. Okay. So I think, again, section 7, road safety education in schools, I think we can deal with in our next meeting, as well as engagement and consultation at 8. I'm not wanting to put you on the spot, Ian, but I'm just conscious of the fact that you have attended this meeting and you did make a contribution at the beginning. Are there any issues that you feel at our next meeting that where obviously you're going to be a prominent participant, we might ask for more information or might flag up, rather than you having to raise them in a month or 5 weeks time and for us to then have to backtrack? Sorry, I'm slightly putting you on the spot, but I'm interested not only from the point of view of your obvious campaigning, but the fact that actually you've done a lot of very valuable research, which I understand has influenced quite a lot of partners.
I think that the way you've designed this scrutiny and the way that you've structured the 2 sessions and what you've chosen to include as of today seems fine to me. So I'm not sat here thinking, oh, you've missed a big part in X or Y. So I don't think I would suggest, from what I've heard today, that you change your design of the next session.
Okay.
And I'm not sat here thinking there's any major holes or gaps. The things I've got in my head in terms of what I would like to share with you next time are either reinforcing some of the things or just sharing my own personal views. So
Okay.
I think, just a long answer.
Thanks for that. I mean, if there's
no.
anything that occurs between now and the next meeting, clearly you can share emails with us. And if there is a presentation you want to make, obviously we can embody that in the agenda papers. Right. Okay. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for your attendance and contribution. As always, it's been absolutely invaluable. And I think, you know, it will help us to perhaps formulate some recommendations on behalf of members that perhaps help to move this agenda forward at our level and from our perspective. So thanks very much. I don't know how many of you are going to be attending the second session, but you're more than welcome to do so. And we would really, really value your input. But thanks very much for your attendance. Okay, and that takes us on to the other wonderful element of the programme of work. Obviously, this is a bit of a moving feast because things will come to us by way of referral. There may be other things that arise. I think we've got at least one issue from our previous meeting to insert somewhere into our deliberations. And we've also, I think, got to think about how we're going to discuss the budget as we move forward. Obviously, adapting the same sort of process as we've had last year. Becky, you look as though you're wanting to say something.
It was purely to flag the fact that I know at the previous meeting I'd mentioned an earlier budget consultation working group than is now likely to take place. So it was just to make members aware that's more likely to be, I think, pushed back a bit given the publication around exec board, but obviously subject to discussion.
Okay, thank you for that. So we agree the work programme subject obviously to any ongoing amendments. Thanks very much, everyone. I think we've had another good session on this issue. Thank you for your contributions. Cheers.